Welcome to episode 3 of the Gentle Knitter podcast. My name is Nicole and I'm coming to you from Ottawa, Ontario. Today is Monday, May 23rd. It's actually, I'm off today because it's the Victoria Day long weekend, which for those of you who don't know is actually in celebration of Queen Victoria's birthday, which is a little weird, you know. I mean, Queen Victoria, that's going far back. I mean, I know we used to be a British colony and we're still part of the Commonwealth, so the Queen's still on our money, and we have a Governor General, which is the representative of the Queen here in Canada, but it's an old tradition, I guess, and everyone has the day off to celebrate the Queen's birthday. So happy Victoria Day. I'm actually in celebration of not so much Queen Victoria as just having the day off. Awesome. I'm drinking a beer. I'm being very Canadian today, and I'm having a beer that my husband brought back. It's called Tante Tricotante, and which means knitting aunt. So it's the knitting aunt beer, and I guess that's the aunt, and she's knitting a very long, what looks to me like a garter scarf. And it's from a microbrewery from the Lac Saint-Jean region, a part of Canada I've never been to, but I would love to, in the province of Quebec. And I love the little description of the beer on the side here. I'll read it in French and I will subtitle what I'm saying, but it says, Quand vient le temps de placoter et de prendre du bon temps, quoi de mieux pour vous fortifier que notre triple soyeuse et légère, avec sa mousse tricotée serrée, sa robe paille et ses houblons francs. So it's describing the beer as having a tightly knit foam, which is okay. I'm not sure. It's a triple ale, so it's actually fairly high in alcohol. It's 8% alcohol, and it's a big one, but I'm not going to drink the whole thing in one sitting, but I am going to have a little bit. Happy birthday, Vickie! Queen Victoria. How are you? It's been 2 weeks since my last recording, and I guess I had thought, you know, I'm not really sticking to that once a month plan yet, which is good. Last time I recorded, I was telling you about a sample that I just finished, and right now I have another one lined up. Actually, I have 2 lined up, but the patterns aren't ready, so I have had 2 weeks of totally selfish knitting, which is absolutely wonderful. And so I have a lot to show you. And so let's jump right into it. Before I start talking about my knitting, I wanted to mention that I started a Ravelry group. And if you go into Ravelry and search for the Gentle Knitter podcast, under the groups tab, you'll find it. So far we have 44 members, which is really surprising because how did people know that it was there? I don't know, but thank you for those who joined. It's wonderful to have you. I've created several different threads. One is just the introduce yourself thread. I thought this would be a nice opportunity for you to tell me a little bit about yourself. So far, you know, with podcasting, it's kind of a one-way discussion, but I would like to facilitate ways of making it a real discussion. So tell me about yourself, where you're from, what kind of things do you like to knit or drink, or are there other hobbies you're into? What are your days like? How do you what's your knitting routine, or what are your knitting rituals? You know, do you always sit in the same chair? What do you like to drink? That kind of thing. I would love to hear a little bit about you. So feel free to go into that thread and join in on the conversation. I also have threads for each episode, and that's where I'll post my show notes. I'll still post them on the YouTube page and on my blog, but there's another spot where you can find the show notes. And I'm really trying to put all of the information of the things that I've talked about in the episode. So if you have a question about something I've talked about, check the show notes first, because most of the time, some of the questions I've been getting, that information is actually in the show notes. I mean, I don't mind answering, but just for your ease of use, the show notes should be fairly informative. And then the third type of thread that I have is a Ask Nicole kind of thread. And so there's where, if you have a question for me about an episode, or just you're curious about something, you can go ahead and post it there, and I will do my best to either answer on the podcast, or I might answer in the thread directly, or I might send you a PM, depending on the question, and if there's a method you would prefer me to use when answering, just let me know and I'll accommodate that. So yeah, come on in, join in the group. I would love to see you there. And thank you to everybody who has reached out and talked to me, not just through the Ravelry group, but by leaving comments on the YouTube page and on my blog and in Instagram. And I've also had several mentions on different podcasts, and it's really lovely to hear from you, and it's really rewarding to get that feedback. So thank you. And it doesn't have to be just, I really like your podcast. If you have constructive criticism, or if there's something you would like me to do differently. I know that I've struggled a little bit with the lighting, and excuse me, and I'm, as you can see, I've set myself up in a slightly different part of the living room, and I'm hoping that the colors will come through a little bit better here. It depends a lot on the time of day that I record, because a lot of the windows in my living room are facing west. So if I record later in the day, a lot of light is coming in, and it can be a little bit tricky. But and then if it's earlier, then it's a little too dark and things don't show up well either. So I'm going to try this and tell me what you think. I also have had some slight sound problems, and I'm trying to address those too. But anyway, I'm learning as I'm going. So hopefully there's nothing too distracting, and you can still enjoy our little chat. So speaking of questions that I've gotten, there's a few that showed up on the feed, on the Ravelry page and on my blog. So the first one is from a person, their Ravatar or Ravelry name is Muguet21, and pretty name. Muguet means lily of the valley in French, and it's one of my favorites, especially at this time of year. Everything's in bloom, and when you go outside, if I'm biking around the neighborhood, I can really smell the lily of the valley and the lilacs on the wind, and it's heavenly. If only they could bottle that. I mean, there's lily of the valley and lilac perfumes, but to me they never capture that fresh and floral fragrance accurately. And I guess it's very difficult to imitate nature. Okay, so Muguet21 asked, what kind of skills do you recommend having before starting the Hermione's Everyday Socks? So if you recall, last episode I showed you my finished Hermione's Everyday Socks. We showed them again, but they're in the wash. And they are a fairly basic sock. It's kind of a vanilla sock, but with a slight, texture to the fabric. So if you're asking specifically about that pattern, I don't think there are any special techniques you need to know. If you know how to knit a sock, you're just you're doing a 4-row repeat that involves some purls into the, like, you know, you're alternating between purl and knit stitches. If you're talking about socks in general, like what skills it takes to knit a sock, well, that's a whole other discussion, I guess. And so briefly, if you're looking at knitting just your run-of-the-mill vanilla sock, basic, from the cuff down to the toe, with a heel flap and, you know, a gusset, there are quite a lot of skills you need to have. You need to know how to knit and purl, because you're starting with the ribbing at the top, which is usually either a knit 1, purl 1, or knit 2, purl 2, that kind of thing. Then you need to be able to knit in the round. That's another, I mean, not all socks are knit in the round, but we're just talking basic sock here. So either on double pointed needles, which are called DPNs, or on circular needles. So that's another skill you need to have. You need to be able to do short rows to turn the heel. Short rows are rows that are not, you're not working fully from one end to the other of the row. You're kind of knitting along past a certain point before you get to the end, and then you're knitting back. In the case of a sock, you're kind of starting at the middle and gradually working your way out, so that you're adding fabric in the middle, and it actually helps to turn the sock, turn the heel. So you need to know how to do that. You need to be able to decrease stitches, because first you need to be able to pick up stitches, and then decrease, because you're picking up stitches to create the gusset of the heel, and then you're decreasing to decrease to make the gusset. And then at the end of the sock, when you're doing the toe, you either need to learn how to Kitchener stitch the ends. So you've got sort of 2 sets of live stitches at the end of the sock, and you're actually with a darning needle and some yarn, you are closing up you're joining those 2 sets of live stitches. And Kitchener is something that is it's not hard to do, but it is it's a little, for me at least, it's not intuitive to start. And so I always have to refer to some instructions to get it going. And then once I've done the first 2, instructions, then I'm off to the races, and as long as nobody distracts me, I'm good to go. Kitchener is one of those things that if you lose track of where you are, let's say you have to put it down and come back to it, well, for me at least, I find it very hard to see where I am in the process. And there's sort of 4 main steps that you have to do. So if you lose track of that, for me, I find it very hard I usually have to undo it and start over, which is why when I Kitchener, I'm like, okay, silence. I warn my husband, don't talk to me for a few minutes. I, mute the TV, or, shut off my iPod. I need to concentrate, but it's not because it's hard. It's just because I don't know, for me, I can't seem to retain it. And so that's one way of finishing the toe. And then the other way is with decreases again. That's actually the toe I generally do is a rounded toe, and just because I find it fits my foot better than a toe that's kind of got decreases and then Kitchener end. Those, as far as I can think of, are the main skills you need to know how to be able to make a sock. But, socks are really not, it sounds like a lot of techniques, and it is. Those are some very important foundational techniques in knitting. And once you know how to make a sock, you can make a lot of things. It really, those are skills that you're going to use over and over again. Actually, when I learned knitting, I learned how to make a sock almost as my first project. I had done I knew how to knit and purl, but I didn't know how to cast on or off. I didn't know decreases or increases or anything like that. I just, I signed up for a knitting class the format was, excuse me, you pick a project and then the teacher helps you along the course of the 6 or 8 weeks that you're in the class. And I decided, but it was beginner, so everybody in the class was a beginner. And I asked the teacher, I said, I really want to learn as much as I can, within the class. And she suggested, well, do you want to learn how to make like a small item, but that has a lot of techniques it concentrated in? And so she suggested a sock. It was, I didn't do it in fingering weight, I did it in worsted weight, so they were like house socks, just kind of cozy socks. But I wanted to learn how to do color work, so we even did a band of color work at the top. And so, it was fine. I actually think that it's a really great beginner project, because if you're taking a class, it's small enough that you are going to have time to get to the next step. I find that if you were trying to learn how to make a sweater or even a scarf, a scarf, first of all, doesn't have a lot of techniques unless you're doing color work or cables or something a bit more complicated, but generally not a lot of increases or decreases. And it takes so long to kind of, you just have a long slog before you get to the end. And so a sock, that to me it's perfect, because like I said, you're working on it steadily, and it starts off fairly easily because you're just kind of getting comfortable with working in the round. And then once you're comfortable with that, then you get into the heel, where kind of all the meat is, where all the more complicated techniques are. But so I've often encouraged new knitters to try socks, because they are really fun and they're such a lovely item to have. Who doesn't love hand knit socks? And it's very motivating, because you're learning a lot. So I hope that answers your question, Muget21. And if you wanted to know something else, just let me know. Then I had another question from Knit1 Teach 2. This person was asking, what is the name of the potter that you talked about, and does she sell her stuff online? So her name is Maureen Marcotte, or Marcotte. It's Marcotte, and I will put a link to her website. So she has a website. I don't know if she sells online though. The website is for her studio. She has a studio and a store in Chelsea. Is it Chelsea or Wakefield? Anyway, in a neighboring area of Ottawa, a beautiful area. And but she is also in Ravelry, and I meant to send her a message and ask if she would be okay with me sharing her Ravelry information on the podcast, but I forgot. So I will maybe I will send her a message, and if she says it's okay, I will give you that information too. Okay, I got an anonymous comment on my blog, and it was actually answering a question that I had. And this person was kind enough to put me out of my ignorance, if you will, about the fiber that I spun and showed you last week that I bought at the Twist Fiber Festival. The mystery fiber. It's actually from Wellington Fibers. That's the name of the company. And they specialize in mohair. I believe they're a farm that raises mohair goats. And so a lot of a lot of the products that they sell are mohair blends, and so the fiber that I got, as far as I can tell from their website, was a mix of a blend of mohair, alpaca, and wool. And so, and it was really lovely to spin. So I'm hoping they're there again this year, and maybe I'll buy more and I'll show you how it comes. It's really neat. It comes in a box, and it's lovely stuff. So thank you, Anonymous. I now know who the mystery fiber is from. Okay, well, that's it for questions. Again, if you have any, please don't be shy, and I'd be happy to answer any queries that you have. Next up, I will show you my one finished object, but it's a big one for me anyway, because I rarely have time to knit myself sweaters. So it's always an event when I finish a whole sweater for myself. It's very exciting. And so that sweater is the beautiful Icelandic plotulopi cardigan. I finished it a couple of days ago, and then just put the buttons on yesterday, I believe. And I'm really happy with it. I love how it turned out. It fits me quite well. It's I wanted a cardigan that was not big and baggy. I wanted it to be just have slight negative ease and be a little bit not short cropped, but kind of just slightly below my waist, because my plan was to wear it in the winter with floral dresses, long dresses that I like to wear, and with tights and probably a shawl around my neck, but that kind of cozy. I think of it as kind of Scandinavian style. So yeah, it turned out really good. It fits me very well, and I'm not going to be wearing it anytime soon, but I really like it. I didn't make any modifications. I knit not the largest size, but the one right before, and I believe I knit on 4mm needles. If I had to knit it again, there's one modification I would make, and that would be to add short rows to the back, because as you can see, the neckline and the back of the sweater are the same. And what happens is when you wear it, it kind of dips down in the back. And if you're like me and you wear your hair up a lot, you kind of get that little cold spot on your neck. And I kind of have a bump there, which is hereditary. My grandmother and my mom have it. And so anyway, if I were to knit it again, which I won't, but I would have made that change. And I knew that. I was like, oh, it'll be fine. But anyway, classic, lazy move. But so this is, just to remind you, it's knit in the round, and it was steeked or cut open to make a cardigan. And then to secure my stitches, because when you cut it open, the ends where you've cut will fray a little bit, I used a crocheted steek. So basically, before you cut it, you crochet a line of you're basically catching two legs of joining of neighboring stitches right at the edge on either side. And what that does is it holds those stitches so that when you cut, the little frayed edge won't go anywhere. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that's actually even necessary to do. I think traditionally they didn't do anything. They did, so the band of stitches that are kind of what you're allowing for your steek, you want it to be probably 5 or 7 stitches wide. And that's not what I did, because I was worried I didn't have enough yarn, and in the end I had plenty. I could have done a really wide steek, no problem. But I wasn't sure I had enough yarn, and I knew because this yarn is really sticky that it didn't matter if my steek was quite narrow. So I didn't, and I knew I was gonna crochet it, so I was not concerned with with having a small steek allowance, if you will. But traditionally, it would be a bit wider, and also in the middle part, you're supposed to weave the color every stitch. So you're doing one stitch in one color, one stitch in the other, and alternating. And then on the next row, you're alternating that. So if you started with a white stitch, then the one above it would be gray, and so on. And that basically kind of weaves everything together. So that also adds kind of helps the whole thing to hold together and not fray. But the reason why it's thought that you don't need to secure your steek is that any type of knitted fabric, whether it's a knitted hand knit object or t-shirt material, or if you think of nylon stockings, when there's a run in that fabric, it always runs vertically. So you don't have unraveling happening horizontally when you have if you have a snag or something. It always runs up and down. That's just the way, that's the nature of how the fabric is constructed and what happens to it if there's a snag. So really, if you're cutting it vertically, if you're cutting it horizontally, that's a whole other issue, and you can certainly have stitches running, but it's not a problem. And, really, once you're picking up the button band too, so you're picking up again a row of stitches, and that button band, that really is another thing that holds the whole thing together. It's really, people are always so scared of steeking. I know I was when I had never done it, but there's nothing to be afraid of, because as long as you're cutting where you're supposed to and in a straight line, you're good. A lot of people will, instead of doing the crocheted method that I did, they will use a sewing machine to sew two rows of stitching along the steek. And that also would help to secure the ends. But the ends will fray a tiny bit. Like, I don't know if you can see, like those are my ends, which are held by my crocheted steek, but that isn't, it's not necessary. And I usually really like this method of crocheted steeking. I'm not 100% happy with how this one turned out, only because, as you can see, it's kind of rippling a little bit. It's not a problem like on the outside of the fabric. It's really nice and smooth, but I think what happened is the yarn I used to steek it is, it was 100% wool, and I should have mentioned at the beginning that if you're steeking, you really want your fiber, the yarn that you're using, to be either 100% wool or, well, basically any animal, like scaled animal fiber you can steek. Some yarns are just the way they're spun, it can be quite smooth, and that is not as ideal for steeking. You want yarn that has a little bit of fluff, a little bit of what I call stickiness. So, Shetland yarns, any kind of woolen spun yarns, any woolly wool will work really well for steeking. And so for my crocheted edge, the yarn I used is 100%, it's actually the chickadee leftover from my vest that I showed in episode 1. And it's 100% wool. It's not superwash, because that's the other thing. You don't want to use superwash when you're steeking, because again, what's giving it that stick is that each fiber hair basically has the scales that you have also in your hair, and those scales scales kind of sit open a little bit, especially when you wash your garment, it kind of opens up a little bit, and then it acts a little bit like each fiber kind of, the scales sort of get all cozy, and that's how things get felted, is that there's a lot of agitation and those scales get really like jammed in, and then it's all stuck together. But you want a little bit of that when you're doing a steek, because that is what helps it not to fray, like overly fray. So to get back to my little Ripley steek here, what happened is, I think, is that the yarn, you need to use a yarn that is thinner than the yarn you're working with, that has a smaller gauge. And although the chickadee is a sport, and the plotulopi, I believe, is either DK or worsted, or it's knit at that gauge, it is, it's very puffy, but there's not a lot to it. So if you were to compress it, there's not a lot of fiber there. And so in essence, the chickadee is denser, and I think it's just too firm and stiff once I did the crocheted steek, and it just is a little bit, it's just got a little ripple, but I mean, it's not a big deal. It doesn't show on the outside. I am going to, there was something I wanted to show you. I am thinking of doing a little finishing on the inside. And you might have seen this already. A lot of people will use a ribbon. They often do it to stabilize the button band. They'll sew a ribbon inside, and it adds a little bit of stiffness to help keep that button band nice and flat. But I'm actually going to use some bias tape. This is Liberty Tanalon bias tape. It's really quite lovely. And it's nice and light, so it won't, I think a ribbon might be too stiff for this very lofty fabric. So I think I'm gonna I'll just hand sew this in to cover that kind of messy steek. And so that if my cardigan kind of flaps open, you'll see this pretty little floral tape instead of this. It's fine. It's not I don't think it's that bad, but it could be better. So what else about this cardigan? It was steeked. I knitted in the round, like I mentioned. And the reason why you would want to do a steek, sorry, I moved the camera there, is because any cardigan that has color work, it's so much easier to do the color work in the round. But with a cardigan, you need the openings. So, usually cardigans are worked back and forth. If traditionally, with a lot of Scandinavian color work and Farrell, the Icelandic sweaters, they are all knit in the round and then cut open. That's the traditional technique. And that helps you to do, when you do the color work, your work is, the right side is always facing you, so it's easier to keep track of the pattern. And also it is quite tricky to work two colors while you're purling. And partly, well, for me, I have done color work back and forth on knitting and purling. And what I find tricky is that when you're working your floats, so the color that you're not using, let's say you have 4 gray stitches and then a white one. Well, and let's say there's white here and here and then 4 stitches in the middle. Well, when you're working those 4 gray stitches, you're carrying the white yarn behind, and it creates what we call a float. So like these long strands here, that's a float. But if you do a float over too many stitches, it it becomes kind of a weak part of the sweater that's easily caught, like on an earring or, you know, whatever, your fingers if you're putting a mitten on. And so what's recommended is that you catch your floats as you are working. If there's a long segment, usually if it's more than 3 or 4 stitches, some people will catch their floats every other stitch, but it depends. I usually will let 3 stitches go by before I catch it. But and catching it means you're kind of putting it on the needle, like it's a little hard to explain verbally, but you're basically putting the yarn in the way and then putting the other yarn and then it kind of holds that other yarn, but then you move it back. And yeah, I'd have to show you, but it's not hard to do, but you just have to know how to do it. And it's very tricky to do for some reason when you're purling. So all that to say that traditionally color work is done in the round. And so steeking allows you to do that because you're just working in the round, and then when you're done, you cut it open. The pattern here I think is so pretty. Just this like floral motif. I really enjoyed doing it. It was a lot of fun. One thing that I wanted to mention for those who may have not tried color work yet, there's 2 things that I always say are really important to keep in mind when you're doing color work. The first one is to be consistent in what hand you're, like if you're holding, you'd always want to hold the same color in the same hand. So for instance, for me, for this sweater, I always held the gray in my right hand and the white in my left hand. You might be thinking, well, why does that matter? Well, it's because your hands, for most people, I'm generalizing here, but will have a slightly different tension in either hand. And that's usually because they're very used to knitting with one hand, but not so much with the other. Some people can do color work and have both colors on one finger, and they're kind of moving the color they don't need to use out of the way. I find that super hard. I'm not good at that. So I have one color on my right hand and one color on my left hand. And as I'm working, I'm either using my right hand to do what they call throwing or English style knitting, and then I'm using my left finger to do continental. So I'm picking instead of throwing. And so I usually knit English style. So right is what I'm familiar with, and I'm not as good with continental. And usually the hand that is not your usual hand will yield a different gauge, a slightly looser gauge. And because it's looser, it will sit up a little more. So the stitch itself will just pop a bit more out of your knitting. And so it becomes the dominant color in your work. So in my case, I always knit the background color in my right hand because it tends to recede a little more. And the pattern, I want the pattern to be nice and crisp, so I always hold that in my left hand because my gauge is slightly looser on my left hand. And you can see it here, even though this yarn is quite fuzzy and that does blur the pattern a little bit, you can still very clearly see the pattern. And that's because I was very consistent and I always held, my pattern color in my dominant. When they say dominant, they just mean the color that's gonna come out because of the gauge. So that is super, super important. When I started knitting, I didn't know about that. And so what I used to do, it's really funny when I think about it now, but I would look at my row and go, okay, this row has, let's say, certain segments where there's 5 gray in a row and only one white, and this row has a lot of gray stitches, so because I'm comfortable with my right hand, I would put the gray strand in my right and the white in my left. And then let's say a couple of rows later it's white that's more frequent, so I would switch and put the white in my right, and so on. And so throughout the chart I would be switching all the time, and what ends up happening is you get this weird going forward and receding in terms of what color is really showing up, and it creates kind of a muddy, uneven looking pattern. So being consistent in how you hold your color is a very important concept in doing color work. And then the other thing that is super important is working your floats in a loose manner. So I was talking a little bit earlier about floats, and that's the color that you're carrying and sometimes catching, but you're basically, if you hold that float too tightly, then the length of yarn is not going to have enough give to match the give of the fabric that's in front of it. And then so that creates a tightness which can result in puckering. You often see that in knit garments where it's kind of like a little bit like this. It's a little puckered here. It looks tight. And even like often I see garments that you have the plain color here, but then where the color work is, it really goes in and you can really see it, like you can see that it's all stretched, and this is kind of puffy, and it doesn't look, it's not, you can usually remedy a little bit of that with blocking, but there is a limit to what you can do. You want floats that are very relaxed, and I don't know if you can see here, see how the floats are really, they're quite loose. And so what you want is, you want a fabric that stretches and that is still elastic. And if your floats are tight, it can't do that. So that's the other very important thing. And how do you keep your floats relaxed? Well, when you're working them, basically what I like to do is I will move my finger a little bit forward when I'm carrying it, and that sort of brings it out a little bit, so that eventually when I knit, like, it's just a little bit looser. And I also just make sure that, the way I've tensioned the yarn on my fingers, it's not tight. So it's got a lot of, it's loose, and you have to try and be relaxed, which I know is a little difficult if you're not that familiar with Fair Isle and or color work. And, the float is usually like, it could be on the hand that you're not used to, and that can cause you to tense up a little bit because it's not comfortable. But with time, it's the kind of thing, obviously, that comes with practice, but it's very rewarding once you kind of, once you're used to it, it's not like I think of it, okay, like make the float, loose. It just happens automatically because you get a feel for it. So I'm super happy with it. It's really pretty. Thank you, Lori, for inspiring me to knit this. The buttons I chose are just little glass, like kind of round buttons. And I bought them in Paris many years ago at La Droguerie, which is it's like a yarn and notions shop. Beautiful, amazing shop with, you could spend a fortune in there, especially their yarn is really nice, but for me, it was the ribbons and the buttons and all that stuff was very, very nice, very dangerous place. So yay, my cardigan is done. If you have any questions about it or about color work or steeking, let me know. As you can tell, I really like talking about that. But I'm gonna have a little sip of my Tante Tricotante beer. Beer is probably not the best choice for a podcast drink because, excuse me, that's why. But it's Victoria Day. I had to celebrate. Good old Queen Victoria. Okay, what's been on my needles? What's in my knitting basket? I've got a couple of baskets here. Here's the first one with a little bento bag, and I love this basket. It's an old birch bark basket that has been in our family forever. I can't remember not having it. I'm sure my parents, I don't know when they got it. I need to ask my mom, but my mom used to use it as a bread basket. And one day, had a slight little mishap, as you can see. She probably, accidentally put it on a hot stove, but luckily it survived. And but I love this old little basket. And inside, I've got a little bento bag, which was made by a company called Ambitalia, but I bought it on the Fringe Association, in the Fringe Association shop, which, if you don't know, it's a really beautiful online shop that's curated by Karen, she also has a knitting blog called Fringe Association, and she is really incredibly talented. She has an amazing eye for, for her merchandise and the stuff that she knits and sews. She's a very talented person. Her blog is wonderful. It's very active. I think she blogs pretty much every day. And she often features different artisans and different products, and she also features patterns, like different knitting patterns that have come out. And I really, really love her aesthetic, and I was really honored when she asked to feature me on her blog. And I think she reposted that. We did that several years ago, but she reposted it recently because I had started my podcast. So so check that out. I'll put a link to it. But anyway, so that's where I got this little bag. If you don't know, a bento bag it's a Japanese bag that's designed to cover a bento box, which is like a little lunch box with different compartments, and usually you have like sushi or onigiri, which is little rice balls and different condiments and stuff. And but they make great project bags, like for socks or Colorwork. If you have a small project, it's kind of a neat way to carry your yarn and your project. So what's in my bento bag? I've got my small flowers mitts, or the beginning of a small flowers mitt. I spoke about it last week, 2 weeks ago, showing you the colors that I'd selected for these. They are, I'm doing it as part of a knit along hosted by Pia of the Kamabornia podcast. And if you haven't checked out that podcast yet, please do it. Don't miss out, because her podcast is so beautiful and I really enjoy it. And she is, I think, somebody who podcasts once a month, and I really wish she would do it more often, but I understand, like, hers is super professional and they do different segments and stuff. So I understand. I can only imagine all the work that goes into producing her podcast, because she's not just sitting in a room like I am blabbing away. She's a pro. Anyway, so she's hosting this knit along, and I had my eye on this pattern ever since it came out. It's designed by Pinaguri. Her name is Anne. I don't know her last name, but she designed this in conjunction with Lee Miller, who's my friend I've talked about before, Lee Side Knits. And so Lee had knit these. She had made up the pattern and then Piniguri, and saw them and asked if she could write up the pattern. And so it's a free pattern on Ravelry. And so it's a little fingerless mitt, and the Colorwork band would be sort of here, and then the hand itself, excuse me, has little eyelets kind of running through it. And I'm really happy with how it's turning out. The colors are showing up a little washed out, especially the middle color should be a little more pink. It's a dusty pink, but this color does not want to show up accurately for some reason. It's showing a lot sort of beigeier, and I can't get it to no, it doesn't like to. It's not reading accurately, but that's okay. So you've got that salmony pink, and then this is kind of a pinkish, rusty brick red, beige, a little turquoisey blue, and then the main color is a really pretty warm brown with little flecks of brick red and pinky orange. This yarn here is like super old Rowan. It's not Scottish. I can't find it. It's basically like a Shetland yarn, but it's I probably bought it like 20 years ago. Anyway, got my little teapot stitch marker, and yeah, hopefully I'll have more. I'd love to have them finished by next episode, so hopefully I will have time to work more. I was kind of concentrating on my cardigan because I was really excited to get it done, but that's that. Next up is, where did they go? Oh, here they are. I spoke about these last week. They're socks in my little Heather Ross Rapunzel bag. I talked about them, but I didn't have them with me. It's the honey badger socks, and it's another very simple, just kind of all over texture pattern. It's eyelets, so little yarn overs, and also you're passing over a stitch over other stitches, and it creates that little line. So very, very cute and simple. And the yarn is same as the yarn I use for my Hermione's everyday socks. It's Regia 4-ply in a pale yellow. It's a little washed out, but it's quite close to the actual color. It's a really kind of pale wheat color. And one thing I wanted to point out is that on my socks, when I'm doing a heel flap, I always do 3 stitches in garter on either side of the heel flap. And this is because I'm not sure where I learned that. It wasn't in the knitting class that I took, but what it does is it allows for, it's really easy to pick up your gusset stitches because you've got sort of a garter bump at every other row. So it's just very, very easy to pick those bumps up, and then you end up with a nice, very, very even gusset line there. So I always do that. So you'll see that usually on my socks, even if I'm following a pattern. If it has a heel flap, excuse me, I will usually add some garter there. All right. So that's kind of my on-the-go I throw this in my bag whenever I leave the house. Then I've got this monster, which I've worked on a little bit since last time. I think last time I showed this to you, first episode, I was probably like maybe here. And I mean, it doesn't look like a lot of progress, but this thing is so big that it takes quite a long time to do one row. I'll show you. So this, and this, that is one edge of the shawl. I mean, it's huge. And then you've got the middle and then the other edge. It is gigantor. But I'm happy that it's that big because, excuse me, I'm just going to shift. Because this is really going to be kind of a blanket for me. Just a nice, comfortable, huge shawl to wrap up in. And my intention is to try and get this done for early June because I'm going to visit my parents in New Brunswick. And they live right on the ocean. And we often sit on their deck and watch the sailboats in the evening, and if the wind's off the ocean, it's quite cool. So I love the way it's turning out. I finished the charted. Well, I'm almost finished. I still have one row of these little eyelets here at the top, and then after that, it's smooth garter sailing for the rest of it. So there's still quite a bit to do. I better get on that to finish it for June. But I love it. It's really pretty, and it's just that lovely squishy garter stitch and the geometric lace, which is what I really like. I like rustic shawls. So yeah, so we'll keep going on that, and maybe I'll be done by next episode. We'll see how soon I record. The yarn is Briggs & Little Briggs & Little Sport. It's a Canadian-made yarn from New Brunswick, and it's very affordable yarn. It's very, if you're on a budget, this yarn is great. It's not super soft, but it's really nice and rustic and squishy, and it's got beautiful. It's very heathered, so it's lovely stuff. The last thing I've been knitting is just a swatch for my Georgetown cardigan, which I talked about last week. And I'm knitting it in Quince & Company Owl, and the color is the Bubo colorway. And I was like, what the heck is Bubo? It's a weird name for a color. So I looked it up. Of course, the internet answered. It's a genus of owls, and Quince & Company Owl. So the great horned owl is, like, if you look at its scientific name, it's Bubo. I don't know what the rest of it, but Bubo is the first part of the name. So it's the genus or the group that owl is in. And so other owls that are closely related are also Bubo. And apparently snowy owls have recently joined the Bubo family. It's not a family, but the closely related group. They used to think that snowy owls were in a genus on its own, but with DNA testing, they realized that snowy owls are very closely related to horned owls. There's horned owls, eagle owls, and fish owls are all part of the Bubo genus. And I love snowy owls. They're my favorite owl. I love owls in general. They are just so beautiful, and I don't know. They're very mysterious and just funny, and I don't know. I just really love them. I work at a natural history museum, and we have a beautiful bird gallery. and it is basically just showcase after showcase of of bird mounts, but we have a lot of owls. And part of me is it a little bit sad that it's all these dead birds, but they're really beautiful, and it's really quite overwhelming to see such a large collection. And I've actually in our collections, I've actually looked at some owl mounts and held them, and owls are actually really small. Like, they look big, they have that kind of log like silhouette, but they're not. Inside they're bird size. They're kind of slim, and it's really their feathers that give them that silhouette. So I thought that was really neat. They're very, very light and small, but very puffy. So and speaking of puffy, this yarn is really light and lovely. It's a mix of wool and alpaca, and which is a lovely blend. I love wool alpaca blends because it kind of mixes the best of both fibers. Alpaca is usually, it's very warm, it's usually quite soft, but if you have 100% alpaca yarn, it's, to me, for my taste, it's not ideal for nice big cardigans, because it doesn't have the elasticity that wool has. So over time, 100% alpaca sweater, especially if it's not like really, really fine, like a commercial alpaca sweater, commercial sweaters are often knit with yarn that's kind of like a thread. That's fine, but when you've got a thicker yarn like this, which is a worsted weight, it tends to really droop and sag over time. So, what used to be like a hip length sweater becomes, a knee length sweater. And it's also really hot, and it kind of gets misshapen. So I'm not a big fan. I love alpaca, but for sweaters, not so much. But if it's blended with wool, then the wool acts as the kind of the thing that holds it together and gives it nice elasticity. But the alpaca is there as the smooth and, well, not smooth, but the soft warmth, and I like to how when they blend the two types of fibers, you get that really kind of like tweedy effect, and I believe this is kind of natural colors, not dyed. Probably like a dark alpaca or a light alpaca and a dark wool or something like that. So very pretty. Bubo. I got the gauge for this is 20 stitches. In 4 inches, and I was lucky. I got it on the first try. I think I knit this on 4.5 millimeter needles, and I always when I do a swatch, I always add 16 extra stitches. So what I'm looking for is 5 extra on either side, and then I always do a garter edge, kind of like my socks. I do 3 stitches of garter on the edge, and actually I usually also do 3 rows of garter at the bottom and at the top. So I get this frame, this garter frame, which helps to make the swatch lay nice and flat. So when I'm measuring it, I'm not struggling with it. The edges aren't curling. I forgot to do it for this, but usually I do that, and it's really worth taking the time to knit a swatch that is big enough to get an accurate reading. And ideally, you probably a bigger swatch would be even better, but this is big enough for me. I've had good results, and well, I say that, although the vest I knit ended up too big, and I find knitting sweaters for myself a bit of a challenge. It's one of the reasons why I love to do samples, is because when I'm knitting a sample, I'm not trying to fit myself. I'm basically trying to just follow the instructions exactly. So, I mean, my gauge does need to be accurate, but I am not worrying, is this going to fit me well? Is it going to look good on me? You know, have I worked the body long enough? Like, those questions are totally out the window, and I'm just concentrating on the pattern itself and reproducing exactly what is in the instructions. And I find that really relaxing. It's nice because, you know, as you know, it's really hard to fit things. And I don't know why the screen went really dark all of a sudden. I don't know if you can see that, but sorry if you can. I'm not sure why that did that. Maybe you don't see it. But anyway, I'm going to proceed. I've pretty much finished showing you stuff, so hopefully it's not too much of a hindrance. But yeah. Anyway, just to get back to what I was saying, knitting samples is a lot of fun, because the pressure of trying to have something that ends up looking good on you is totally not there. So I like that. And also the other thing I like is that usually there are techniques that demand a bit more effort, and if I were knitting it for myself, I might be like, I'm not going to bother doing a tubular cast on. You know, just a regular cable cast on is good enough. But, you know, when Jared Flood sends me a pattern and it's got a tubular cast on, you can be sure that I'm doing that tubular cast on. And he's right, because those finishes are, you know, beautiful details that really add to the garment, but they are a bit of a pain sometimes to do. So, you know, when it's for myself, I'm not as picky, and I tend to I just want to get it done and wear it. And so sometimes I cut corners a bit, and you know, the results are there. If, for instance, if I had knit the Plotulopi cardigan as a sample, I would have redone that steek. I wouldn't have left it like that. That would not be acceptable for me in terms of you know, if I had to submit that as a sample, but it's for myself, so whatever. You know what? I think that's it. There were a few other things I wanted to mention, but I'm already over an hour, and you know, you have other things to do. If you're celebrating Victoria Day, you might have a barbecue, or you know, you're cracking open a beer like I did. And if not, you hopefully are having a good week. And I look forward to talking with you again. And next time I will tell you about a beautiful publication that is coming out from Carrie Bostic Hogue. It's a magazine called Making, and subscriptions are available right now. And I will just say that if you're hesitating about getting a subscription, do not. I've seen kind of an advanced copy, like a PDF of the layout of the first issue, and it is stunning. It's absolutely beautiful. I contributed a little something to that issue. And it, you know, great, but I wouldn't, that's not the reason to get the magazine, trust me. The reason to get the magazine is to subscribe, is that it's filled with amazing knitting patterns, you know, by Cecily Glowick MacDonald and Mary Jane Mucklestone, and of course Carrie's got several designs, and Hannah Fettig. Cal Patch has a little crochet pattern, and then I have you know, my friend Lori from Lori Times 5 did a little essay on journaling. The thing is just chock-a-block with beautiful projects. There's knitting, sewing, embroidery, kids crafts, recipes. It really is absolutely stunning, and it's beautifully done. Of course, the photography is impeccable, the layout, the whole thing is absolutely gorgeous. And next time I will show you some photos of some of the projects that I'm really excited about. I literally will knit everything that's in that magazine. So go on Carrie's website and check it out. And I encourage you to subscribe, and I will talk more about that next time. But for now, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to talking with you again. All right, bye.